Part of this video is sponsored by Medea. This chocolate bar costs 89 cents and it took me exactly 1 minute to buy. It tastes pretty good, like nothing spectacular, but very respectable chocolate. This chocolate bar, on the other hand, took me over 1 month to make completely from scratch. What I mean by that is I started with actual cacao fruit. I fermented the beans, I dried them, I roasted them, I cracked them, I ground them, and even bought obscure equipment to turn them into supposedly proper artisanal bean-to-bar chocolate. That is because online, this process looks suspiciously easy. Someone cracks open a cacao pot, does a little fermenting, pours glossy chocolate into a mold, and suddenly they're Willy Wonka. But let me tell you what, I'm actually not buying that. So I decided to find out, what do these videos actually leave out? Can you really make great chocolate from scratch at home? Is it even remotely worth it? Because this process was more complicated, more expensive, and considerably weirder than I expected. Oh, and several moments when I became convinced I had spent a ridiculous amount of money making something worse than 89-cent supermarket chocolate. And actually, I still don't know the final answer because I haven't tasted this bar yet. I'm saving that for the rest of this video. But first, I want to show you what it actually takes to turn fresh cacao fruit into a finished chocolate bar. The equipment, the failures, the money, and everything those beautiful little TikTok videos forget to mention. Let's find out if I just learned an incredible new food skill or if this was a big waste of time and money. Now it all starts with these cacao pots, the fruit of the cacao tree from which chocolate is actually made, believe it or not. You can order fresh cacao pots online from a few suppliers, although they are not cheap. I ordered these couple of pots for around 100 bucks. The pots already look incredible. Depending on the variety, they can be purple, greenish, reddish brown, or somewhere in between. They look slightly otherworldly, I think, unlike any fruit you would normally find in a supermarket. That only gets more extreme when you open them. It looks completely bizarre. Inside are dozens of seeds covered in thick, white fruit pulp. And this, believe it or not, is the actual cacao fruit. The pulp around each seed is edible. You can put one in your mouth and suck the fruit away from the seed if you want, and it actually tastes pretty pleasant. Slightly citrusy and tropical, a little tart, a little sweet. What it doesn't taste like is chocolate, not even remotely. And then there's the seed itself. You can bite into it, it tastes raw, green, bitter, extremely astringent, and sorry for the slightly unappetizing demo, but the inside is pink or purple. Let me actually cut one open. Look at that. Completely purple. Let's go slowly. The first step is to remove all the seeds. There's also a firm central spine running through each pod, which you can just discard. Then you want to collect all the pulp-covered seeds in a bowl. Around 20 minutes later, this is what I had. An entire bowl of fresh cacao seeds. Which finally brings us to the next crucial step, fermentation. Transfer the seeds into a container with a flat base. They can be stacked slightly, but ideally you don't want a tall, dense pile. Just something like this is fine. Loosely cover the container with a lid and technically, that would be it. Look, a lot of short videos simply tell you to leave the cacao like this for a few days. That leaves out one very important detail. Cacao fermentation works best at high temperatures, ideally around 35 Celsius or above. Which is why I built a slightly more elaborate setup, my cacao fermentation station. The beans sit inside this loosely covered container with a temperature sensor. Underneath is a heating mat. The mat is actually designed for plant seedlings. It is normally used for gardening, but I'm using it to keep the cacao warm during fermentation. And then this container sits inside a second, larger container. Our sensor is then connected to this controller where I set the target temperature and it automatically switches the heating mat on and off. You don't have to go all out like that. You could probably just do something similar in an oven with only the light switched on, and if you live somewhere naturally hot, you might be able to ferment the cacao directly on the counter. But if you remember, I spent 100 bucks on these cacao pots and I really didn't want to mess this up. And that's why I went with a controlled setup. Once a day, you gotta open the container, let in some fresh air and mix everything thoroughly. This actually helps the beans ferment evenly. And over the next few days, you can see the process happening. The white pulp gradually ferments away, the smell becomes boozy and fruity with something slightly sourdough-like and definitely quite yeasty. But hey, apparently that is still normal. You simply have to trust the process, keep the beans warm and stir them every day. So I did. And then normally, when you get to this stage, most of the fruit pulp should have fermented away. But in my case, quite a lot remained, which was concerning. And when I cut open a bean to check, the inside was still mostly purple, with only a little brown beginning to develop. This was not disastrous, but it was not ideal either. A well-fermented bean should actually be considerably darker inside by now, which means that now I had a bit of a problem. The beans had already been fermenting for 7 or 8 days, and recommended is more like 4 to 5, so leaving them even longer would increase the risk of mold or other unwanted growth. Which honestly made me a bit anxious. But at some point you just have to stop waiting for perfection and move on. And so I did. And the next stage was drying. All these wet, sludgy beans, now smelling yeasty, fermented, and almost a little yogurty even, needed to be completely dehydrated. So I grabbed the dehydrator tray and started placing beans onto it. And you know what? I immediately realized they were still far too wet. So I decided to add another little step. And this is actually not unheard of in cacao processing. I transferred the beans into a sieve and just carefully washed them. And I'm pretty sure that was absolutely the right decision. I mean, check this out. The remaining pulp came off almost immediately, the beans looked much cleaner, and spreading them across the dehydrator trays became far easier. At least visually, this felt like a major improvement. And now, they just had to dry. You can use a proper dehydrator or an oven with a dehydration function. The important thing is to use a low temperature and give the beans plenty of time. Because they're quite large, you want to dry them for at least 2 days, potentially even a bit longer. Just let the moisture escape slowly. In my case, the process took around 3 days, and after all of that, this is what I ended up with. Yes, dried cacao beans, except these beans did not look right at all. Most of them had shriveled and almost completely deflated. They looked less like proper dried cacao beans and more like sad, failed almonds. And when I opened one of the collapsed beans, the inside looked even worse. It was pale, it was strange, it was almost empty. There was barely any bean inside the shell, and what remained did not look promising. There was a bit of an encouraging sign because a few of the beans had stayed relatively large and plump, and when I opened those, the inside was actually much darker, considerably closer to a properly fermented cacao bean. And speaking of properly fermented and dehydrated cacao beans, this is probably a good time to come clean about something. Whenever I attempt an ambitious project like this, I usually do an off-camera test run first, just so I know what I'm getting myself into. So before making the batch you have been watching, I had already tried this once. Something very different happened. When the big pots for my test batch arrived, the pulp didn't look fluffy, taut, and juicy. Everything actually seemed more compact and just slightly shrunken inside the pot. And look, at that time I didn't think much of it because this was the very first cacao pots I ever had in my hands. Even more interestingly, when I cut open some completely raw unfermented beans, many were already surprisingly dark, almost black inside. I fermented them pretty much the exact same way, stirring once a day for 4 to 5 days before drying them. And after dehydration, those beans from that test batch remained large and plump, extremely dry obviously, but still very much intact. I actually believe that the pods I used for this video's batch were not fully ripe. Now looking back at the footage, I feel like perhaps the green areas outside should have warned me, but I just didn't have enough experience to recognize it. Perhaps they need more time to mature inside the pod. But look, I wasn't gonna throw away an entire batch of carefully fermented and dried cacao beans without at least trying to continue. Especially because what I did end up with smelled quite promising. Fresh, fruity, fermenty, distinctly cacao-esque, but what they lacked was the deeper toasted flavor we associate with chocolate. And that, unsurprisingly, comes from, you guessed it, roasting. So I decided to go for a little bit of a Hail Mary. I spread the dried beans onto a tray and put them in my trusty oven. Now for roasting, you actually want to go with a considerably higher temperature than for drying. Around 120 Celsius or 250 Fahrenheit for approximately 20 minutes is a good starting point. That gives you a light roast, preserving more fruity and acidic flavors. You can then raise the temperature slightly for a few more minutes if you prefer your chocolate toastier, nuttier, and less fruit forward. And those 20 to 25 minutes of roasting make a huge difference. This is what my beans looked like after. Some had actually puffed up slightly, which made me cautiously optimistic. until I opened the first one. I'll be honest, the inside was still pale and mostly empty. And although the beans were not burned, they completely disintegrated when I tried to open them. They just crumbled into dust between my fingers. The test batch I made had been completely different. I wish I would have filmed that, but you only know after. What's actually supposed to happen is that you end up with a dark, evenly roasted bean like this. After roasting, the thin outer husk becomes brittle and separates easily, and on a small scale, you can actually just peel it away with your fingers. On an industrial scale, this is obviously done mechanically. This process is called winnowing. The beans are usually cracked and an airflow blows away the light pieces of husk, just leaving you with the heavier interior. That interior is called cacao nibs, which you actually may have seen at stores before, and now you know that cacao nibs are simply the fermented, dried, roasted, dehusked interior of the bean, usually broken into small pieces. And it's these nibs that you actually use to make chocolate. Except with my hollow, crumbling beans, there was no realistic way to separate the husks from the few cacao nibs that the more intact beans were, saving for me on the inside. I decided to simply accept the fact that we started with under-ripened cacao. So at this point, there are two sensible ways to continue. Both a little disappointing, but pragmatic. The first is to just buy whole cacao beans that have already been properly fermented and dried. The fact that these guys have been dried but not roasted means you can still roast them yourself and control the flavor. The husks come off cleanly, revealing beautiful fragrant cacao nibs, which at this point already smell unmistakably like chocolate. They actually even taste like chocolate. They're still very bitter and not particularly rounded or balanced, but the core flavor is clearly there. There is, however, an even easier and even more reliable option. You can simply buy good quality roasted cacao nibs. And yes, these have already been fermented, they have already been dried and roasted and winnowed and broken into pieces. And honestly, you and I, we already know exactly what needs to happen to get them to that stage. Ultimately, my goal for this video had been to make bean-to-bar chocolate. So even though my filmed batch of home fermented cacao had somewhat failed, I think it was fair to just pick the process back up here. These may not be my own home fermented nibs, but they are the exact ingredient I was trying to produce. And believe me, the process is actually far from over. But before we go there, let me actually tell you about the sponsor of today's video, Midea. You've seen me use this beautiful oven throughout today's video. This is the Midea Flexify Pro, a great staple for your kitchen you can use to make so many of your culinary dreams come to life. For example, the Football World Cup finals are coming up shortly. I'm gonna host some friends, and instead of ordering takeout, I want to surprise them. A good currywurst with fries is the ultimate stadium food for me, and pizza is a takeout classic. So let's combine both and make a unique currywurst pizza. For that, I'm using a tomato-based curry sauce as my base, topping with plenty of cheese, a few slices of bratwurst, and of course, French fry pieces. Now to bake, I'm using one of the dedicated pizza modes. The oven actually comes with more than 10 cooking functions, including air fry, plus 4 dedicated pizza modes depending on the style of pizza you're making. But now take a look inside. This is the Flexify Pro's graphene heating element. Because it preheats so fast, using this large oven won't even heat up your room. About 10 to 15 minutes later, our pizza is ready. And the result is what we all wanted: crispy outside, juicy inside. Ooh, the aroma is already amazing. Just look at how my pizza came out. This is gonna be the star of my watch party. If you're looking for a versatile oven that can handle everything from roasting cocoa beans to pizza night, definitely check out the Midea Flexify Pro. You can search for it on Amazon and you'll find more info in the video description below. Thank you, Midea, for sponsoring this video. Alright, we're back with our roasted cacao nibs replacing my failed home fermented beans. And we somehow need to turn them into a completely smooth, flowing chocolate mass. And look, this is truly where a lot of TikTok videos do you dirty, because they make this step look suspiciously simple. They suggest all you need is a powerful blender, something like a NutriBullet or a Vitamix. And technically, yes, you can put cacao nibs in a blender. You can run that blender for 10, 20, 30, 60 minutes, repeatedly stopping it to scrape down the sides, create an enormous mess, overheat the machine, and come dangerously close to destroying it. You will eventually get a paste that looks pretty smooth, but don't let let those looks deceive you, because the chocolate will almost certainly still feel quite gritty on your tongue, which can detect particles as small as 20 micrometers, which is very small. And sorry guys, but your NutriBullet just won't get that far. What you guys need instead is something like this. Now this is a wet grinder, sometimes called a wet mill. It consists of a rotating drum with a stone base, and then inside are two heavy stone wheels, along with a scraper that continuously pushes the mixture back underneath them. You place this assembly into the drum and then tighten it with the screw. But you know what? For relatively small batches of homemade chocolate, it works surprisingly well. Let me show you. So this machine has exactly one button. Switch it on, the drum rotates, and the stone wheels roll across the base. You then gradually add the cacao nibs. Do not dump them all in at once. Add them little by little, giving the machine time to crush and incorporate each addition. And at first, everything will look extremely rough. The machine is going to bounce around slightly, the nibs will remain chunky, and you may wonder whether this is even going to work. But it will. All you need is time. So you want to loosely place the lid on top to protect yourself and the surrounding area from escaping pieces, that is. Then you can turn off the lights, go home, and get a good night's sleep, because this machine is gonna take its sweet time. Yes, even with the correct equipment, refining cacao nibs into smooth chocolate takes around 24 hours. But when you return, you will find something genuinely beautiful. The rough, dry nibs will have transformed into a glossy, flowing, almost hypnotically smooth chocolate mass. As the stones grind the cacao, friction produces heat, and that heat melts the cocoa butter naturally contained in the nibs, gradually turning solid cacao into smooth liquid. And when you taste it, it's actually already gonna taste remarkably like chocolate. And you know why? Because it actually is chocolate. At this point, this is essentially 100% chocolate, fermented, dried, and roasted cacao ground into a smooth paste. A bar at a fancy shop labeled 100% dark chocolate is basically made from this. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of extremely dark chocolate. Unpopular opinion perhaps, but I actually love good milk chocolate. And to get there, we actually need to still add a few ingredients. First, powdered sugar. You want to add this gradually, one spoonful at a time, allowing each addition to incorporate. Next up, we got milk powder, which gives us the creamy, milky flavor that separates milk chocolate from dark chocolate. Again, you want to add this gradually so the machine does not become overloaded. Then the next ingredient is technically optional, but I consider it a major improvement, and that is additional cocoa butter. Yes, the cacao nibs already contain plenty of cocoa butter, but we are actually adding so much sugar and milk powder here that we dramatically increase the proportion of dry solids in the mixture. Without some extra fat, the chocolate can become a little bit too thick. So additional cocoa butter keeps it smoother, more fluid, and more pleasant in texture later on. Then we just need a few final touches. First, we got vanilla. I'm using pure vanilla powder rather than artificial flavoring. You only need a little, but it rounds out the chocolate and gives it more depth. Then of course salt. Almost every good sweet benefits from salt, and chocolate is no exception. And then finally, one slightly unusual ingredient, and that is lecithin. I'm using soy lecithin, although other types can work as well, and lecithin is an emulsifier. Without going into too much chemistry here, it helps the fat coat and distribute the solid particles more efficiently. That in turn will improve the flow, creaminess, and just overall texture of the chocolate. Optional, but highly recommended. So we put that lid back on and let the machine do its thing for another 12 to 24 hours. I told you this takes time, but those extra hours are absolutely worth it, because the chocolate at the end is unbelievably smooth and silky. The surface is so glossy, you can practically see your reflection in it. It's just incredible. And taste-wise, we are already operating at an extremely high level here. I mean, it tastes amazing. Rich, round, creamy, luxurious. In terms of flavor, we're there. It's just that texturally, it's, still soup. We need to turn this thing into an actual chocolate bar, which unfortunately is just not as easy as pouring it into a mold. Don't believe the TikTok videos, please. First, we need to remove these enormous stone wheels. And yes, I know, it looks like a huge amount of chocolate is stuck to them, and there definitely is some. I mean, if you really want to, you can lick them clean for an excellent chef's treat. Quite good, but trying to scrape everything off creates a gigantic mess without recovering nearly as much chocolate as you'd expect. So for the greater good, I let that chocolate go. Instead, we're gonna turn to the main drum, now filled with beautiful molten chocolate. Transfer all of it into a large bowl first. A glass bowl can work, but I highly recommend one of these very affordable, large stainless steel IKEA bowls. Look at this beautiful glossy chocolate. I genuinely cannot stop licking it from my fingers because it already tastes so good. But we still need to turn it into a proper bar. So for that, we need a simple setup. First, you need a pot wide enough to support the bowl, but considerably smaller than the bowl itself. Add a little bit of water and bring it to a gentle simmer, creating essentially a double boiler. Then place the chocolate on top and begin stirring. A large whisk would have been ideal, although this tiny one was apparently all I had, but keep the chocolate moving so the temperature rises evenly. That's the important part. Speaking of temperature, you will also need a thermometer. The easiest option is an instant read infrared thermometer because you can repeatedly check the temperature without sticking anything into the chocolate itself. Gently warm and stir until the chocolate reaches 45 to maybe 48 degrees Celsius. And at this point, you might be wondering, what exactly are we doing? Well, this process is called tempering, and you will not get around it if you want to make chocolate. If we poured the chocolate straight from the wet grinder into a bowl and allowed it to cool, it would become sort of firm, but it would not have the texture of proper chocolate. It wouldn't be hard and snappy. It would soften very easily and begin melting as soon as you touched it. No, as soon as you look at it even. Maybe. It's not just about snap and texture, it's also about the perfect glossy appearance, by the way. And for tempering, the first step is heating the chocolate until all of its existing cocoa butter crystals have fully melted. And for milk chocolate, that means approximately 45 to 48 degrees Celsius. Now you know what we're doing, but let me confuse you again, because once fully melted, we need to cool it back down. To be precise, we need to lower the temperature of the chocolate to around 27 degrees Celsius. Now, unfortunately, right now, I'm doing this in the middle of summer and my studio is around 28 degrees. So even if I left the chocolate on the counter for hours, it would never get cold enough. Instead, we're gonna make something like a reverse double boiler. For that, we're gonna place the bowl of chocolate over a second bowl filled with cold water, ice water, or just a mixture of water and ice. And this is why I recommend using such a large bowl. As you stir the chocolate while cooling it from below, it is essential that not a single drop of water enters the bowl. Even a tiny amount of water can cause molten chocolate to seize, transforming it from glossy and fluid into a thick, gritty paste where there's no coming back from. With the reverse double boiler setup, you want to keep stirring gently and continuously. Make sure the bowl remains stable and no water splashes over the sides. You want to check the temperature regularly as it drops. The chocolate will gradually become thicker, which is normal. We want it to fall just below 27 degrees Celsius. After cooling milk chocolate to around 27 degrees, the final tempering step is to warm it back up slightly to approximately 29 degrees with a maximum of 30. And yes, I know it sounds incredibly finicky, but going those final 2 degrees back up make an enormous difference. Now finally look at this. I could do what I had been trying to do all along. I could finally pour the chocolate into the molds. And by the way, you do not need to fill the entire mold in one enormous pour. I just started with one large blob in the center, which initially looked completely wrong, but you can gently encourage it to spread until it fills the shape. Once the mold is filled, I just give it several firm, confident taps against the table. This helps air-trapped bubbles to rise and escape. And yes, now all the chocolate has to do is set. And this also takes a little time. I left the mold at room temperature for around 2 hours. Just give it a little longer than you think because the cocoa butter crystals need time to form a strong, stable structure throughout the bar. But then once that happens, something magical should occur. Because properly tempered chocolate, as it cools and then crystallizes, it contracts slightly. And that tiny contraction actually causes it to separate from the mold, which means that instead of digging it out, you should be able to turn the mold over and simply release the finished bar. Oops. I don't love this. Oh. Yes. That is what I was looking for. Just check out how beautifully glossy and shiny this chocolate bar is. And that's it, guys. That's how easy it is to make your own bar of chocolate from scratch. This video actually ended up being so long that my top light just turned off, which is a sign we need to finally give this guy a try. Technically, I know we did a little bit of cheating because I replaced my home fermented cacao beans with properly processed cacao nibs, but I still went through every stage of the process, including the stages that failed. And this guy is what I ended up with. Was this all worth it? Is this homemade chocolate genuinely better than something I could have bought at the supermarket for 89 cents? I mean, I did the math. I spent around 200 bucks for the wet grinder alone. Then there were cacao nibs, cocoa butter, milk powder, sugar, all the other ingredients. Oh yeah, of course, around 100 bucks on the fresh cacao fruits. Then there was my fermentation station, you know, the heating mat, the temperature controls. You will also need an infrared thermometer, rigid molds, dedicated spatulas, and all the other small pieces of equipment. Then depending on what you already own or not, you may need a dehydrator or an oven with a reliable dehydration function. Now, taking all of my failures, test batches, restarts, ingredients, equipment, everything into account, I estimate that I have spent between 600 and 800 euros to produce a little over 1 kilo or 4 bars, plus a little more, of chocolate. That is a really bad price per bar. Now, obviously that calculation is not entirely fair. Most of the equipment only needs to be purchased once, and if chocolate making became a serious hobby for someone, every future batch would be considerably cheaper. That said though, there is one part of the process I would definitely never repeat again, and that is fermentation. Next time I would begin this process with high quality cacao nibs, or perhaps properly fermented and dried whole beans at best. And it's not because I'm unwilling to put in the work, you know I'm not. The problem is there are too many variables you can't control. The ripeness or quality of the pods you receive, how they were harvested, stored, transported. And then there's the fermentation itself, which is affected by temperature, quantity, microorganisms, the amount of pulp, yada, yada, yada. Trying this once was fascinating. The first off-camera test batch worked surprisingly well, and that was satisfying. But when I repeated the same process with many more pods for the filmed batch for this video, it failed. I'm actually somewhat happy it did because I got to show you all the things that can go wrong, which is the truth about home chocolate making. It's fun, it's interesting, but so much can go wrong, and I wanted you to see all of it. So this is it, the big moment. Let's finally give this guy a try. First, let's see if there's a snap. Yeah. That was a surprisingly good snap actually, because it's pretty warm in this room right now, and the store-bought chocolate has a lot less of a snap. This is already better than store-bought chocolate in one regard. Oh my God. The texture is so good. All that tempering work paid off. It's so creamy. How can I describe this flavor? Beautifully rich, round, luxurious. Man. There are nuances in this chocolate that I don't normally find in mass-produced supermarket chocolate for sure. Actually, let me try. Okay, this, compared to that, tastes so sweet, unnecessarily sweet and flat. This, on the other hand, only sweet enough to taste good. And everything else is just complex, rich, powerful chocolate flavor. This is good. This is good. And there's even a little bit of like a homemade wildcard flavor to this. Less standardized and more individual. And it is absolutely worlds better now that I've had it side by side than the average supermarket bar. 100%. You could play around with different nibs from different origins and varieties. You can decide how sweet and milky you want the chocolate and how much additional cocoa butter to use, all of these things. I'm gonna go give these to friends and family to try now. I'm excited. I think I may have discovered a new hobby.